and officially thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our panel discussion on careers in the humanities outside of academia. I am very pleased to have our three esteemed panelists with us, Dr. Tara Schwegler, Dr. Zach Linge, and Dr. Chris Jarrett. So what I would like to do is turn it over to them to tell us a little bit about what they do professionally. And we'll start with Tara.
Great. Thank you so much, John. So my name is Tara Schwegler. I have a PhD in anthropology, and I began my career on the academic side of things as an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. But I made a transition to the corporate sector about 12 years ago. I began researching, doing UX research or user-centered research at UTSA, which is a large financial services company here in San Antonio. And in 2014, I formed my own consulting company called RedSquared Consulting, which focuses on using qualitative research to help financial service companies and nonprofits better understand their customers' needs. And actually, I'm about to start a new job as a research director at Meta in a few weeks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tara. And we'll go over to Zach.
Hi, John. Hi, everyone. I'm Zach Linge. It's good to be here. So I got my PhD just a few years ago in creative writing. And since graduating, I've worked both inside and outside academia, both as a professor of English and as a news analyst. And in my all-ac position as a news analyst, I worked for a private intelligence agency. And in this position, I wrote daily news briefings for President Biden, the First Lady, Vice President Harris, and senior White House personnel. And for this contract, my team and I produced 10 to 30,000 word daily news analyses of both current events and how the news channels tell the news. That's me.
Thank you, Zach. And last but not least, Chris.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Jarrett. I received my PhD in anthropology as well in 2019. And I now work at the Veal Museum, which is a natural history museum in Chicago, in a program called the Andes Amazon Program within a center within the museum called the Keller Science Action Center. And what we are a multidisciplinary applied science team. And we do these studies called rapid inventories, rapid biological and social inventories in remote parts of the northern Amazon. These are studies that are designed to collect information in a rapid fashion that is useful for decision makers. And specifically, we're interested in producing information and building coalitions that can help to drive action related to environmental conservation and well-being for rural communities in the Amazon. In addition to the rapid inventories, we also have a few other initiatives that bring together actors across the Putumayo River watershed. So 4-country basin that makes up Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. And so we organize events that bring together NGOs and government officials, indigenous communities, campesino communities, and other key stakeholders in those areas to coordinate around environmental governance and to implement some of the binational and trinational agreements that that often come out that kind of bring those down to reality on the ground. So we're actually organizing one of those events in a couple weeks in Brazil. So that's what I'm currently focused on. It's great to meet you all and looking forward to the discussion.
You know, I know 2 out of the 3 of you and meeting Tara for the first time, but just from your introductions, and even though, like I said, I know 2 of you, I've heard Chris speak before a couple years ago in an alumni career talk. I know Zach, and yet just from your introductions, I'm very excited about posing our questions to you just based on your backgrounds. And I also love that, you know, obviously COVID was not a good thing, but what it enabled us to do is move to technology as far as how we deliver some of our programming. And without that, we would not be able to reach out to Zach, who's on the East Coast, Chris, who's in Chicago, and Tara, I believe you're here in San Antonio, correct? Yeah, so I mean, we're all over the place, and pre-COVID, this would have never been done. So I'm very excited, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Lily, who will be posing the questions to our panelists.
All right. Well, it is lovely meeting all of you guys. Thank you for your bios, and I am super excited to start the discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and pose our first question, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to Tara Schwegler. I hope I'm saying that right, Tara Schwegler. So coming from an environment where graduates are assumed to remain in academia, how have you overcome potential challenges of going down a path that is not considered conventional for those in the field of humanities?
Great. Thank you so much, Lily. Well, it's interesting. So my path outside of academia was rather unplanned in the sense that I was in the academic sector. I was an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, and we had a family move to San Antonio. My husband accepted a job here. And so I had a situation that many academics are familiar with called the two-body problem and my problem was I was married to another anthropologist. But that actually opened up the opportunity for me to start thinking about what would a career outside of anthropology or outside of the academy look like. And I would say one of the first major challenges I had was really just understanding the landscape, like where to look, what kinds of resources, how could I translate my skills? So I would say the first barrier for me was just understanding what the opportunities were. I think that is changing as the academic job market changes and as more people are realizing there just simply aren't enough academic jobs to absorb everyone who has a PhD. But I would say that the second challenge that I had to overcome, and I think you allude to it later on in the panel questions, is my own sense that I'm supposed to be in the academic sector. Never really asked myself where I wanted to be. It's just that when I started with the PhD, I assumed that's where I would be. And to be fair, when I started considering careers outside of the academy, I didn't really reach out to my faculty members, not because they didn't support me, but because I was wondering what they might think about my saying that I was going to look for a career outside of the academy. And so it took a lot of time. I would say it took a good 2 or 3 years for me to get to the point where I understood leaving the academy is not a failure. Leaving the academy is not doing something wrong. It is actually the source of a very enriching career for me. And I've seen people make all sorts of decisions outside to pursue careers outside of the academy based on their own personal needs. So I know of people who don't want to be tied to a specific geographical location, as academic jobs often require you to do. I've seen people who don't necessarily want to potentially move from one visiting assistant professorship to another visiting assistant professorship in search of a tenure track position. And so what I would encourage individuals who are finishing up their PhDs now is to think about what matters to them. What are the aspects of an academic career that they really like? It was funny because one day when I was saying to my husband, oh, I wish I would have gone on. I should have stayed in the academy. He said, well, what is it that you wanted to do in the academy? I said, well, I wanted to do research, I wanted to write, and I wanted to teach. And he said, okay, so those are the 3 things you want to do. And what are you doing now? And I said, well, I guess in my job now, I'm doing research and I'm writing up results and I'm teaching at UTSA in another position. So in some ways, he's like, so you're doing everything that you wanted to do. And I said, well, I guess you're right. It's just that I wasn't doing it in the way that I thought it was expected.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I think I feel like a lot of students can definitely probably relate to that and definitely should take that advice and their next steps and taking their next steps. So the next question I'm going to go ahead and give to Zach Linge. What tips can you provide on how to translate your PhD or graduate skill set into a competitive non-academic resume?
Thank you for the question, Lily. And I just want to second everything that Tara just said in response to the first question. That's been exactly my experience with that one. In addition to which, like challenging that narrative that I've been telling myself, I think is a big thing that I'm hearing there. How can I challenge this one idea that I had of how to move forward? And that ties in for me with the second question, which is very pragmatic. How do we translate these graduate skill sets into competitive non-academic resumes? My best advice, I think, for that is to study the genre. Anything academics are good at, it's figuring out how to identify conventions of a genre. And because we're coming into the private sector or public non-academic sector with certain expectations for CVs and skill sets in mind, it's kind of an adjustment. And so one of the things that, two of the things that I did when I was transferring was, one, finding people who had CVs and resumes who were in positions that I envied. You know, my kind of go-to advice is always find the person who is where you want to be and copy everything that they've done, you know? And so that was what I did. I found their, you know, I found some heroes and I looked at their careers. I looked at how they got there. I looked at the skill sets that they highlighted and capitalized upon in their application materials, if available, but especially in their public profiles. And in the same way that I would in like an English 200 class, was figuring out, okay, how do we organize it? What are the type action words that people are using? What are some of the conventions that seem to be a bit staid at this point? And ask for feedback is another big thing for me. If I'm moving from one professional world to another professional world, I shouldn't expect that I know the answers yet. And I can expect that there are always going to be helpers. There's always going to be someone who's available who is happy to help me make that transition. I think that's what I've got.
Thank you. Chris Jarrett, how can a background in humanities help these students excel in other fields?
Thanks for that question. I also agree strongly with Tara and also with what Zach just said. And I think my response would sort of build on what Zach was saying in terms of applying those skills that you apply to your own research to the field that you're going into. And I think that's a lot of what a background in the humanities provides for you, is an ability to synthesize a large amount of information, to do deep, in my case as a cultural anthropologist, doing deep listening, open-minded listening, and trying to collect as much information before you try to develop what your strategy for entering the job market would be. And then once you're in your position, trying to sort of do ethnography of of your new cultural world, because there are lots of unspoken expectations, roles, and responsibilities attributed to different people within the academic space. And the same thing is true of other professional worlds. And so, for instance, you know, in my experience here at museums are a really interesting sort of hybrid academic, non-academic space, in the sense that there's a portion of the museum that's public facing, and there's another portion of the museum which I work in that's public facing in the sense of being actively engaged in policy work and in work with sort of applied research with communities. And it took me a while to understand just the institutional structure of the museum, what the hierarchy looked like, what were the implicit expectations. And so I think applying that same lens that you would apply to your research to your new cultural world would be the main advice that I would have for excelling. And I think that could take you far in any field. Also learning I think, as this kinds of sensibilities that you develop as a social scientist or humanities scholar around trying to understand different patterns of communication and technologies in the broad, like, anthropological sense of technologies, not just like software, but the different ways that people connect and engage, and how they exert power, and how direct you're able to be in certain spaces versus others. All of those are skills that I think humanities training provides, and that's very useful in other professional contexts.
Great, thank you, Chris. So I'm going to go ahead and have the next question answered by Dr. Schwegler. You did kind of hint on this in your previous question, but I'm going to go ahead and see if there's anything that you want to add on to it. So there is sometimes a stigma associated with choosing an alternative career that is not academic. Did you have such an experience? And if so, how did you handle it?
Thanks, Lily. So I would say I felt a stigma. So I graduated, the time that I was making the transition into corporate work was about 12 years ago. And I can tell you that my faculty advisor really expected that I would stay in the academy, and had this idea that I would make another personal move with the family to continue to chase an academic job. Again, it might have been an unfair assumption on my part that he would not be supportive of a non-academic career. But I think it's fair to say that in that environment, it was not unreasonable for, there was so much fanfare around, oh my gosh, whatever academic job you get, whether it's in Alaska or it's on the other side of the world, you should take it no matter what, even if it's not a salary you're sure that you could live on, drop everything and go and do it. So I felt that there was a stigma, but one thing I can tell you is that I feel that there has been a really significant shift. And it's interesting, I feel this at the personal level. So I was asked this year to become an alumni in residence at the University of Chicago to participate and to mentor graduate students, much as we're doing in this panel. And they just inaugurated this program a year ago to start helping their graduates find jobs outside of the academy. And so for me, this was a real turning point that suddenly I'm being asked for expertise and how to get students ready. And it's interesting that's not just students attending these events, but faculty members are attending too, because as I mentioned before, the numbers just don't support the continuation of the same level of tenure track positions out there. So what I would encourage, and I say it's easy for me to say this, it's hard to do. Don't let, I love the way, Zach, you phrased it, that you have to challenge the narrative. You can't let your imagination of how this career should be dictate important decisions in your life. So I really advocate that individuals sit down and figure out what is most rewarding to me about my work in the PhD. What is something that I really want to continue doing in outside of the academy, and what are things that I'm willing to flex on. And maybe salary is an important one. Maybe where you live is an important one. Maybe the kind of schedule you have is important. So figure out what matters most for you, and then decide, does an academic career enable that, or does something else enable it?
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Schwegler. Did any of you guys want to have an input on that specific question? If you guys experienced something like that, and how did you guys handle it?
I could add something, and I think there is a generational change occurring around this topic. At least I felt that. I got my PhD 3 or 4 years ago, and I was fortunate enough to have an advisor who was supportive of all different routes post-graduation. And so I personally didn't really experience this stigma, at least not from, my advisor, my committee members. I think there are always going to be people in the academic world who see academic work as the end all be all, but you just have to know what is important to you and, the kind of work that feels meaningful and impactful for you, and where you feel like you can actually build a viable career in livelihood terms too. I think, and I know we might have more questions about salary later on, but I do think that for a lot of people, just the economics of contingent academic labor don't add up, especially if you are single and providing for yourself, or if you have children or other, financial responsibilities. And so a lot of people, will need to look to other opportunities to be able to have a viable, financial reality. And so I think, unfortunately, that is the impetus in a lot of ways for a destigmatization, like the economic reality of it's almost impossible to survive with the salaries of contingent academic jobs, that is actually contributing to a destigmatization. And the fact that it's coming from that precarity, I think is a problem. But the positive side effect is that the destigmatization is allowing for broader conversations and for people to feel like it is a normal and natural transition to move between strictly university academic spaces and all things all in between, like museums or intelligence agencies or research offices within corporations. I think part of what we have to be doing is sort of unsettling those divides a bit too, and not thinking about academic work as exclusively confined to the university or professorial context as well.
I really agree with that last point, especially Chris, that there are so many fields where there is just an obvious one-to-one application of what you learn in graduate school. And it is like, it's a huge world, and the thing that's true, in my estimation of the academy, that is true for most communities, is that it's similar. And there tends to be a sort of echo chamber of possibility, which is what I really want to champion from what Tara said about don't let your imagination dictate what's possible for you. I think especially I don't have, my experience is not the sort of linear school to school to school to a job thing. I took years off in the middle of school, came back, finished my bachelor's, did some different types of work. And I think that for those of us who do take that slightly more traditional approach and go straight through school to trying to find a job in academia, we're underexposed to what's possible and what's available. And what's really cool is, like Chris was just saying, like we're representing wildly different fields here, coming from similar educational backgrounds. And there's also overlap. One of the things that's neat is that we have two social scientists on the panel. We have a humanities person on the panel. And in each case, all of us have garnered skills that apply to each of these professions, right? And that's one of the huge things here, is that user experience is something that a person with a humanities background can develop the skills requisite to explore. News analysis is someone who has an anthropological background in research can absolutely develop the skills to explore. And so there are so many ways to apply the skills outside of the university. I think what's so terrifying is not knowing what's possible. And so sometimes it does take a really challenging organizational structure or economic structure like the university has been experiencing increasingly for the last 50 years to kind of provide that impetus. But once you're on the other side, like the advantages are there, it's not, the water's fine, come on in.
Awesome. Thank you all for all of y'all's input on that specific question. That was beautiful. This next question is going to be for Dr. Jarrett. So who did you find to be the most supportive allies and advocates in for non-academic careers in your life?
So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I was lucky enough to have actually academic advisors who I feel like were pretty open-minded about the ways that an anthropology PhD could lead to all sorts of different careers. So I feel really grateful in that sense. My advisor, Mike Sepek, was really excellent in that way. But one of the things that I started doing as I was finishing my dissertation that I think really helped me to understand that universe that Zach was just trying to start to map out was I started doing consulting for NGOs, universities, governments in Ecuador, where I was doing my where I did my dissertation research. And even though these were short, sometimes 1, 2, 3 month projects, that helped to expand my professional network considerably and helped me to understand what some of these bridge positions kind of looked like. And then that ended up connecting me to the network that I'm in now. And in the field that I work in now, in environmental conservation, it is a wide network, but there are some key nodes. And so I think I was lucky enough to get to meet some people in those key nodes. And in some cases, like in conservation, there are some universities who have particular programs that are focused on tropical conservation, like the University of Florida. There are some foundations like the Moore Foundation that are aggregators of funding for a lot of organizations. And I was fortunate enough to have a supportive academic course, but also to oh, sorry, it seems like the connection dropped there for a minute.
Okay. No, you're back though. You're good.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jarrett. Thank you. For this will, were you, I just want to make sure that were you done? Like, I didn't want to, like, I believe probably some people were able to kind of catch in and out what you were saying, but I didn't want to like cut you off if you weren't done.
Yeah, I think I finished. I'm not sure if you caught all of it, but apologies for the connection challenges.
Okay, it's okay.
It's part of our new reality and these
Very
kinds
true.
of events.
So Dr. Linge will have the next question. How did you figure out how to negotiate non-academic salaries?
This one's really fun. I like this question. I think in part because I had this expectation of what's possible for me as a humanities person, because I remember when I was in undergrad and I was talking to this to a different kind of major, not a humanities major. And I don't want to dish on any particular field, so I won't say what this person was majoring in. And she asked me what I was majoring in, and I said English, and she said, "Oh, so like you don't like money?" Which is, I mean, fair. You know, it's fair. It seems like those of us who study anthropology or English, or I mean, get a PhD in creative writing, which seems like the least practical thing you could possibly do, are destined to like sacrifice, to sacrifice salary and health insurance and all of the rest of it forever. The thing was, for a long time, I had this dream that I would be a professor. I would teach poetry. And for me, if I was going to consider leaving that dream or opening it up to different possibilities, then I wanted to be paid, is what it comes down to. I'm like, all right, so I can have the dream and a terrible salary, in many cases, or I can find something that I find fulfilling in a different way, but I'm going to want to get paid for it. And so when I was applying for positions, I knew what I would get paid for an assistant professorship. That was my baseline. If I was going to leave the academy, then my starting salary needed to be equivalent to my educational background. I'm gonna just like zoom out a little bit and just say as a preface, like, I feel strongly about this. I might be coming off a little cocky about it. I just want to say, like, for me, it's one of those things where I'm like, if you have a dream and you're like, I'm gonna explore outside a little bit, I mean, fight until you get what you're worth, is my thinking here. And so, when I was offered my position outside of academia, I Googled what negotiations look like, just like I Googled what negotiations look like inside academia. How do you word that type of response? When is it appropriate to talk about salary expectations? What is an appropriate range? Is asking for 10% above the offering salary too much or too little? Is asking for 20% too much or too little? And my thinking was, for the position that I was taking on, it's intense. That job is intense. And so when I was offered a salary, I Googled how to negotiate to get what I felt I needed to make the position worthwhile. So how do I figure it out? I ask around. I ask around for friends of mine who are outside of academia. I make sure to develop, like when we're talking about allies and advocates during this transition, I make sure to develop relationships while I'm in school with people outside of school. A hugely important thing for me was having a community that is outside of the institution. And that gave me that network of support that I needed when it came time to figure out these really practical things. And the cool thing is, like, you don't just have transferable skills by having gone through a master's program or a PhD program. You have that attached to your name. You have the credentials. And so when you're competing for a position with other highly qualified candidates, that title goes a long way. So relying on that support system that I developed outside of the institution, Googling what the appropriate language is, and most importantly for me, knowing what the position would be worth to me.
Great, thank you, Dr. Linge. The next question is going to be for Dr. Schwegler. Where have your academic and other skills and experiences fit within a non-academic career path? So how is that translated now?
Sorry about that. Yes, thank you, Lily. So what I would say is that we had a discussion, a panel that I, for this alumni and residence program that I was speaking to a couple of weeks ago, and there was this big debate between theoretical skills and practical skills, and this idea that, oh, there's theory that you learn in school, but you might not actually apply that, and then there are these practical skills. And I have to follow up on what Zach said. I think that, first of all, yes, in my day-to-day work, do I talk about Max Weber with clients? No, generally not. But I think it's a mistake to assume that all the theory and the work that you do to develop your critical thinking skills, that that's somehow separate from what you do every day. I think that that kind of skill to be able to take a problem apart, to figure out a hairy problem and say, okay, not only do I know how to go and figure out the genre, how to understand all of the arguments around this particular problem, but then I also know how to chart a course, because after all, isn't that what a PhD is? A PhD is figuring out an important problem in your discipline and finding a research path to answer that question. That's what that degree means. And so I think everyone, no matter what field they're in, always needs to remember that's the skill that you're getting. And that's the respect that you accrue having those letters after your name. So never to forget. I find for me personally, one of the skills that's respected the most is my understanding of research, both qualitative and quantitative research, and how to design a valid study, and how to understand the limitations of different types of research forms. So to get a question and then be able to connect that and say, okay, this is the research strategy that we need to use.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Schwegler. Dr. Jarrett, how have others found challenging and rewarding work outside of the academic setting?
So I assume this is a question about other people that I know of that have had similar pathways. I think it has a lot to do with something that Zach was saying a few minutes ago, and that I mentioned in a slightly different way, which was to build networks while you're in school that go beyond school. And so I think understanding the cultural worlds that you want to get connected to, understanding what they find important, what drives them, also understanding honestly where the flows of funding and money are going is another really important skill. And conservation, in the conservation world, a lot of that has to do with understanding new waves of funding that are coming from different sources. So like right now, the big wave is the Bezos Earth Fund that's now filtering through some of the big NGOs like Conservation International and making its way to local communities through regional or national NGOs. And so if you understand that, then you can understand where will the opportunities all along that chain emerge. And I think similar things happen in business and in government. You know, when there's a new when new legislation is passed, there's a whole series of chain of events that happen after that to fund a series of programs. And so if you can trace that, then you can understand where some opportunities might emerge. And I think that's one good way to put your research skills to use. And it also can be just sort of fascinating to understand the infrastructure of how money and power shapes the world in different ways, and how you can show up in different spaces with your values and skills and play a role in moving some small part of the world in a direction that you feel like is the right direction. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jarrett. Dr. Linge, what does the process look like when launching your non-academic job search? What resources did you use during your search?
All right, I had to find my notes. Just looking down at. Okay, right. So there are a billion ways that you can approach this. You know, there are as many right ways to approach this as there are to write a poem. For me, The position that I ended up getting was remote. But the offers that I got more frequently were local. If I had to do it again, and one of the things that I did prioritize when I was searching, um, I was searching for where I wanted to work rather than what I wanted to do. What are the companies in my area or in the area where I want to live that are interesting to me? I live in Raleigh right now. I found out that the company that does Fortnite, the video game, is like right around the corner. And I was like, what would it look like to work there? And I mean, that's one of the approaches. Like, where's the fun for me in this environment, in this place where I want to live? What's a thing that I could get excited about? I think the biggest mistake that I made when I started searching was to fall into that swamp of online job searches, and to think that that's where I was going to first find my position, because it's so overwhelming. When you're looking at a list of 40,000 jobs in a given region, like, no, no, like it's already intimidating enough to be on the market. And so for me, like the best way to start is thinking about, okay, where are the places here that I'm excited about? So I was applying for or looking at positions at local art nonprofits. And just a quick anecdote, I applied for a directorial position at one of these, and just a month ago, this is like a year after the fact, a different organization reached out to me and was like, hey, so and so sent me your application materials. We have this director position opening up. Is that something we would love to interview with you if you're available? And that's the type of thing that happens in the community level that doesn't happen on the national level. And so for me, prioritizing the specific region where I want to work and figuring out what companies are there that I could see myself like investing in long term. And the big thing also about that is when I find that company, I want it to be not just what I can put up with, but a place that I can grow in for a while. Because one of the biggest differences between academia and non-academic work is if you want to have longevity in your career, you need to be able to commit to a company for a long period of time. You can switch schools multiple times. You go to 3 different schools before you graduate, and that gives you like a lot of credibility. But it's helpful to have like, oh, so I did 2 years at this position, I did 5 years at this other position, I did 14 years at this other position. My understanding is that type of longevity looks really, really good on a resume. I'm going to see if there's any, and then you can do the big search engines. Then you can be like poet jobs locally and find nothing. I'm kidding. That's all I've got.
Thank you, Dr. Linge. We're gonna have one more question. Dr. Schwegler, let me see. Okay, so what kind of salaries do humanities PhDs make in a non-academic industry?
I think the salary ranges, as you can just tell from the diversity of backgrounds here on today's panel, I think the salary ranges are going to depend not only, I would say, nonprofits, it's going to be a bit lower. Government salaries in the corporate sector, jobs tend to be better paid. I'm going to stick in my lane here. I did actually look up some numbers for user experience researchers. And what I found on Glassdoor was that the pay range is generally between 70 to 150,000 per year, with an average salary of about 85,000. Now, I looked at a couple of different sites to see, and there were discrepancies. So I don't know if we're comparing apples to apples, et cetera. But what I would say to reinforce Zach's point is that when individuals, if they are looking in a particular area to grow a career, first of all, they should create a LinkedIn profile and they should start following hashtags in that area, because they can start to look at, they'll get access to all sorts of content. They'll be able to make connections with people in that field. So, and that's also where you get, I think, a lot of great job tips. My new job that I'm going to start in a couple of weeks, Meta reached out to me on LinkedIn. So I think that understanding the power of some of these digital tools is really important. I know for me, a job search still looks like you put together a resume and you send it to the employer and that's how it happens. But I think that our job world is changing so rapidly that I would strongly encourage students to leverage all the digital resources at their disposal. And also to follow up on Zach's point about if you're in a particular geographical area and there are companies that you're interested in working for, the more robust your network, the more likely it is that someone you know knows someone who works at that company and can give you a warm introduction. And so I think sometimes the idea of networking feels unnatural to many academics. It shouldn't, because we also need to network in the academic world. But I would encourage students, especially when they're starting out, to go ahead and connect with people who may not seem to be exactly in your same field or exactly what you're doing, because you don't know how those connections can evolve. You don't know if that person knows someone who might be able to help you out.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Schwegler. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to move into the Q&A session part of our session. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to John Schaefer.
Thanks so much,
you,
Lily.
everyone. Before I stop the recording, I want to officially thank Zach and Chris and Tara for being with us this afternoon. I was eagerly listening to all of your answers, and I really appreciate your contributions. So as of now, I'm going to stop the recording